So good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a part of research methods, which is data collection. And then on the second part, we're going to discuss about bias and confounding. So our learning objectives for this session is that you guys should be able to illustrate important data collection methods and relevant tools, distinguish the common forms of research bias and how to avoid them, and understand the concepts of confounding in health research. These are all very important concepts in order for you to be able to develop a research protocol that will generate valid conclusion. Because if your protocol is full of research bias that are not adequately addressed, as well as confounding that has not been identified, it could model or make you generate invalid conclusions without you even knowing it. Okay? So for the first part of our data collection, we're going to talk about data collection. So data collection is the process of collecting information from all relevant sources to, number one, find answers to the research problem, test the hypotheses, and evaluate the outcome. So data collection forms the bulk of all the sort of hard labor, no? When talk about research, doing research, no? The hard part, of course, is developing how to do the data collection. But the tedious part is doing the data collection itself. So it's very important that before you actually collect data, how you collect the data is well planned at the beginning. And that's what you do when you develop a research protocol. So what are the factors to be considered before data collection? Of course, your research question and your research question, and based on your research question, that's how you develop your objectives and the scope of your research, the different sources of information, the type, the accessibility. Are you going to do a survey? Are you going to do interviews? Are you going to get blood? Are you going to do chart review? Quantitative expression, the measurement or the scale. Are you going to do a survey scale? No? Remember, if you've answered one of those surveys like yun, the Likert scale, I forgot the different parts of the Likert scale. Very much agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. That's your standard Likert scale. So that's an example of a scale. The techniques of data collection and the unit of collection. Are you just going to do individual collection, one person at a time? Or are you going to collect, let's say, per family or per cluster? Check per class if you're surveying a school, no? When you plan your data collection, you think about the source of information, where you're going to get the data that you're going to collect. So you determine the sources of the data. And when you determine the sources of the data, you have to think about data requirements. So for example, your source of data are pediatric patients, no? So what does interviewing pediatric patients require? So usually these studies would require full ethics review, plus you need a consent form from the parents and an assent form from the pediatric patients. So you also have to consider the budget, no? If you have to, let's say, fly to a far-flung area in order to collect data, you need to take into consideration your travel requirements, and so on and so forth. The data collection design. So are you going to do a paper-based data collection, an electronic survey, and a data acquisition plan? So this is a sample of a data collection plan. This is just an example. Of course, this is not written on stone. You can have variations of the data collection plan, but it's important to have a plan and not just dive into starting data collection once you have a a, a plan in mind, no? So identify the types of data. It has to be able to answer your research question and address your research hypothesis. And then determine the types of measurements and variables that you're going to get, the instruments and scales, methods are you going to use. Later on, we'll discuss that. And then you, before going full blast, let's say your target sample size is 1,000 patients, no? You have to pilot test it first. The pilot testing will enable you to troubleshoot what problems you will potentially encounter if you implement it on a full scale. So for example, you pilot test it for, let's say, 20 patients, and you see, oh, the patients takes like an hour to answer the survey question. So that's a limitation. Or a lot of patients put in blanks, no? That's also a limitation. So you will be able to troubleshoot so that before you actually implement it on a large scale, you have already made some adjustments so that you will not have any problems at the end of the day, in the middle of the data collection. And then the data collection forms, the operational procedure should be reviewed and then eventually implemented. So if you're going to adapt some instruments, or let me just put on my, so let's say you're going to use some instruments, no? Survey instruments that have been developed by other authors, you might need to ask for permission before you can use it in your study. Or sometimes if the survey instrument was developed in another language, like the English language, you might have to undergo translation into the Filipino language or whatever dialect you need to use before you're able to implement it into your population. So there are two data collection categories of data collection. Primary data collection methods, which we divide into quantitative and qualitative data, and then secondary data collection methods. So for primary data collection, it is collected from the field itself under the control and supervision of an investigator. So original data is collected specifically for the purpose in mind. So you have a research question, you formulate the data that you need to collect in order to answer your research question, and you get the data from the original source. For example, the patients themselves. No? This is collected from first-hand experiences from your data source. It's more reliable, authentic, and has not been published elsewhere. Usually, if the data collection, if the design, and the data collection techniques are very well formulated, the validity of primary data is greater than secondary data. So there's a caveat to this. So if your primary data is not well executed, no, it might not be as valid as a secondary data that has been generated very well. Okay, so the advantages of primary data is that targeted issues are addressed. So whatever data you need, you'll be able to collect it. No? And except, for example, unlike in secondary data, the data is already there. You can't control what is the available data. The data interpretation is better. There's high accuracy of data because you're able to control what type of data you collect, and you can address specific research issues, and you have greater control over what data you'll be able to collect. So the disadvantage is usually more costly because you still have to collect the data, time consuming, you need more personnel, And sometimes there's inaccurate feedback. It requires training skills. No, usually if you hire research assistants, you have to train them first before you expect them to go to your research subjects, and it is more laborious. No? So primary research data collection is divided into quantitative data, either in the form of surveys, no, experiments, observation, or even simulation. Qualitative data can usually be generated through focus group discussion. So you form a group of people of that meets your eligibility criteria, and then you discuss things, no, based on a format. That's your focus group discussion, and that's also a form of data collection. Individual in-depth interviews, or what you usually call as key informant interviews. Usually it's a one-on-one interview with a subject. In human observation, so sometimes you can observe, let's say, if you're looking at the effects of playground on children, you can go to a playground and observe how children play, and even case studies. So those are examples of qualitative data. You cannot count, but you can describe the data. So what's the difference? No? In qualitative, so usually it's verbal. Usually you just generate concepts, no? So for example, there's three people, let's say you're in a focus group discussion and you have a question, and then these three people are agreeing on one concept. So you have just that one concept that can be part of your data. While in quantitative, it's usually, because of the name itself, it's numerical. You can count the data. Okay, so let's say in a survey, 10 out of 20 people agreed that A is good for B. Example. The purpose, if it's a qualitative research, is to gain an understanding of underlying reasons or motivations. Usually, these underlying reasons or motivations cannot be captured by quantitative data collection. It can uncover trends or provide insights into the setting of a problem, and usually it's termed as exploratory research. It helps you generate hypotheses regarding a certain population. On the other hand, for quantitative research, no, you're able to quantify data and generalize results from a sample from the population of interest. So for example, among patients with diabetes, um, let's say use of insulin is associated with um, good quality of life. No, I'm not sure. Just made it up, but that's an example of a quantitative data generalized into a sample of population of interest. It can measure the incidence of a particular occurrence, view, or opinion in a chosen sample. So this is usually what we're more familiar with. Question types: open-ended, what, how, and why questions. Well, in quantitative data, usually it's closed-ended. How many, how often, how much. The number of participants, usually it's few. In a focus group discussion, you can have as few as, let's say, 7 people, 7 to 10. More than 10 is actually too much already for a focus group discussion. Or even just one if it's a key informant interview. Or several people that you do key informant interviews with. In quantitative data, you usually have to have a sample size in order to produce reliable result, in order to generate generalizability. So you can generalize your conclusion from your population of interest. Typical methods in qualitative, as I mentioned earlier, FGDs or focus group discussion, KIIs or key informant interviews, and ethnographies. In quantitative, you have surveys, experiments. So as part of experiments, you have your randomized controlled trials. That's an example of an experiment, experiments on humans. And you also have, let's say, your observational studies, your cohort studies, your chart reviews. Those are examples of quantitative data collection. For the data analysis, usually in qualitative interviews, it's non-statistical. Data cannot be expressed as a number. Usually, we group the data you generate into concepts or themes. No? In quantitative, usually the analysis is through statistics. If you are going to do uh, descriptive statistics or analytic statistics. So in primary data collection methods, you can do observation, interview, questionnaires. You can also generate data from a database. So for example, in the Philippines, we have REDCap registry. It's a registry of all people undergoing dialysis. So you can actually generate studies from that. We also have an acute coronary syndrome registry from which you can generate data and others. So for the observation method, the information is sought by way of the investigators' own direct observation without asking from the respondent. So you just, but usually, I have to put a caveat on this because usually if you're going to do an observational study, you have to ask for an informed consent from the subject that you are going to observe. No? This is usually common in behavioral sciences, suitable in studies which deal with subjects who are not capable of giving verbal reports. So observation method example would be, let's say, you're observing patients with autism spectrum disorder, and you want to observe their behavior or observe people in a certain tribal community. You can do that also. Things to keep in mind: what should be observed, how the observation should be recorded, or how the accuracy of observation can be ensured. You can have controlled versus uncontrolled observation. So usually controlled is experimental studies, RCT. You control the intervention. But in cohort or cross-sectional study, you don't control their exposure. The exposure will depend on the person. So for example, in cohort cross-sectional studies, an example of an exposure is smoking. You don't control whether the patient is smoking or not, or the amount of cigarettes they smoke. In an experimental study, the investigator will be the one controlling the intervention. Let's say you're going to expose them to a certain drug, or you're going to expose them to a certain educational intervention. No? So that's an example of the difference between experimental and observational studies. The interview method is also another technique of primary data collection, where you can question respondents individually or as a group. So you can have telephone interviews, personal interviews. Usually you have two kinds: structured, unstructured. Structured, you have already a set of predetermined questions in an interview, and you use standard techniques of recording the respondent's answer. You usually have a form already, and then you also have a recorder. So an example is, if you or a female relative is expecting a baby, would you prefer the labor and delivery to be at home or in the health post or in the hospital? Can you say why? So, and that's a standard question for all interviewees. In an unstructured interview, you can have some flexibility to the approach. You can just have, let's say, a take-off question, and then you can explore from there. From there, you can have follow-up questions. So, for example, this is, let's say, if you are a female relative expecting a baby, ayan, that's an example. Please tell me about giving birth to your first child. So let's say the patient or the respondent says, I prefer to have a home birth because I want to be surrounded by my family. I want to be surrounded by my family when I give birth to my first child. And then you can have like a follow-up questions like, did your husband agree to you having a home birth, or did you have any fears about going to during when you choose doing a home birth. So you're free to explore the topic. So that's an example of an unstructured interview. So it will depend on you as the investigator on which kind you would like to choose. But usually in the social sciences, we do mostly unstructured interview in the social sciences. In the health sciences, usually we lean towards doing a structured interview. Actually very easier to do than an unstructured interview because, you know, doing key informant interviews or focus group discussions also takes a lot of skills. No, it's not as easy as just asking questions. No, it really takes a lot of skills because I've tried doing this focus group discussion. Um, Sometimes the respondents are unpredictable. No, so sometimes you can't control the direction of their answer. Sometimes they would deviate away from the topic. So it's really up to the skill of the interviewer or the moderator in order to steer the discussion towards the topic at hand. Questionnaires, no? Questionnaires, very common, no? Very commonly used, no? Especially by trainees, a collection of information like asking questions of members of the study population. It could be face-to-face interview. You have a question and then you directly ask the respondent to answer, or it could be self-administered. You just give the questionnaire, give instructions, and ask the respondent to return the questionnaire to you. So those are examples. Now we move on to secondary data. Secondary data is data that has already been collected by others. Usually, they collect the data for another purpose. So that's why in primary data collection, you can cater your data specific to your targeted issue. No? But in secondary data, the data is already there. So you can get it from journals, periodicals, research publication, official records, example of which will be the records of deaths, yung death certificates in the what do you call that, in the National Statistics Office. Now, those are examples. Or even the PhilHealth data. They have a database for all patients who utilize PhilHealth. You can also utilize that as secondary data. It may be available in either the published or an unpublished form. So for example, the PhilHealth data was not specifically designed for your study's purpose, but it was actually designed for PhilHealth use. But you can also utilize that. So resorted to when primary data sources or methods are not feasible or inaccessible. So the advantages is quick and cheap because the data is already there. It can capture a wider geographical area, longer orientation period, and it could lead eventually to collecting primary data. Disadvantage, it may not be able to fulfill specific research needs. So for example, you're interested about diabetes and how diabetes hospitalization affects mental health. If you just go to your PhilHealth data, it cannot capture that. Or even if you do a chart review, it cannot capture that because they collected the data for a different purpose. It can have poor accuracy, no? Especially if it's just fulfilled for, let's say, reimbursement purposes. Not up to date. Sometimes it's poor accessibility in some cases, no? Because of some red tape. Primary data, you can collect it real time. You're sure about the sources. It can directly answer your research question. However, there's disadvantage of cost and time, but you can actually avoid bias, no? Especially if you're able to pre-identify sources of bias prior to data collection, and it is more flexible. In secondary data, it's usually past data. You can be unsure about the sources, no? You might have difficulty refining the research problem based on the available secondary data. And but the advantage is it's cheap, less time consuming, but some certain biases cannot be ruled out, no? And it is less flexible because the data is already there. Data sources for health research, for primary sources, you can have medical records, actual physical exams, laboratory testing, self-reported measures like interviews and questionnaires. In secondary sources, you have your disease registries. That's the one that I mentioned to you before, your renal disease registry, your Red Cup, and your ACS registry, birth and death records from the National Statistics Office, and even published literature. So for example, we did a national COVID profile study among adults under the Philippine College of Physicians. You can actually ask those who did that study if you want to do a sub-study. They can write a letter to the person, to the corresponding investigator. We would like to do a sub-study on COVID on, let's say, patients with diabetes. Can we access your database of all patients included in the COVID study? So that's an example of a secondary source data. So next is we're going to discuss on how to write the methods part, no? Essentially how you will collect data in the protocol, no? Because it's the most important part of your research protocol, aside from your research question and your objectives, is the methods. Because if the methods is well planned, no, you've identified potential sources of bias and confounding, then you will have a very, very smooth sailing data collection and valid conclusion at the end. Because sometimes, if your methods are not well planned, and you can encounter um, a lot of problems during your data collection that might be hard to remedy when you're already in the middle of it, or when you're already at the end of your data collection and that's when you identify sources of bias or confounding. So it's very important that your methods or your data collection techniques are well planned at the beginning, even before you start the first ever data collection. So the method section is the most important part of the paper, and flaws in this section can lead to confusion later on, rejection. No? So you might receive letters like this, like sorry to hear about your rejected paper, or condolences on your failed experiment. So you don't want to receive any of those rejections. So when we write the methods, you can write it as if you're writing a recipe. And when you write a recipe, the details are very important, especially in baking. So the details, you have to write the methods in as many details as possible. No? So if you actually encounter some randomized clinical trials, they're actually able to publish a full paper just on their protocol, no? And not even the rest of the paper. So this is the usual outline, no? Of course, this is not written on stone again, but this is usually the standard flow depending on your study design. So first, you identify your study design, your study population, sampling technique, instruments to be used, especially if it's a survey or a key informant interview, or you're going to use a scale. Data collection, description of the study procedure, how you're going to allocate patients if you're going to do an RCT, and your intervention, outcome measures, and statistical analysis. No? So when you choose the study design, this is the single most important decision that the investigator has to make. Because if your study design is wrong, then you will not be able to answer your research question properly. And the choice of study design will dictate the rest of the methods. So the study design sets, as I mentioned, sets the tone for the rest of the methods. I just like to remind you guys, there's no such thing as a retrospective cross-sectional study. This is one of the most common mistakes that I see when I'm reviewing papers from students and trainees. Even if it's a chart review, but if the data is taken at one point in time, that's a cross-sectional study. It's neither retrospective or prospective. The study site, you have to describe the setting of the study site and why you chose this study site. So for example, your study site is Perpetual Health Medical Center Las Piñas. It's a 500 bed capacity that is a tertiary hospital that caters to mostly patients in Las Piñas and nearby cities, Parañaque and Cavite, etc., etc., etc. And then you justify why you chose that site. So in the methods, next is your study subjects or your participants. You define the target population and you define it by setting a specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. So let's say your target population is people living with diabetes. And then you want to sample it, you sample people living with diabetes in the community. Let's say your setting is a barangay health center. So that's how you took the sample. So the sample is a representative set of your population. So it's very important that your sample is representative of the population so that it will capture and you can extend your conclusion or generalize your conclusion to the rest of the population. So it's very important that your eligibility criteria is what I say, bulletproof, no? Because a poorly written or poorly conceived criteria may undermine a study's generalizability and scientific validity. So how do we write a well-written eligibility criteria? The number of eligibility criteria should be kept to a minimum because if your eligibility criteria is very, very, very specific, you might not be able to enroll enough subjects for one. Let's say you have your criteria is adult patients aged 20 to 40 years old, diagnosed with diabetes with normal BMI, with normal fasting blood sugar, with normal HbA1c, with no known family history, no? That's very stringent eligibility criteria. Instead of let's say your sample size is 1,000, it might take you 10 years before you're able to recruit patients that fit your very specific eligibility criteria. Second is, it limits the generalizability of your paper. So for example, that was your very, very specific criteria. Then the conclusion from your study will only be specifically applicable or generalizable in that specific population. If let's say you cannot extend the conclusion to patient with diabetes that is 50 years old or with family history of diabetes, no? So it limits the generalizability. So you should only pick criteria that should include only those absolutely necessary to ensure scientific validity and patient safety. So what are the usual people that are excluded? No? Pregnant women, the very young, and the very, very old because of the patient safety issue. So the eligibility criteria should be clearly defined and verifiable by an external auditor. What does this mean? So for example, I create a protocol, no, that will be implemented nationwide, and I have several investigators, let's say from Mindanao, and the investigator from Mindanao should be able to apply the eligibility criteria to their setting, no? Okay. Next is your sampling procedure. So sampling procedure should include both the sample size computation and the sampling technique. This is usually skipped by trainees, the sample size computation. And that's usually the first thing that I look for when I review papers on by trainees, because your sample size computation and your sampling technique ensures representativeness and reliability of the sample and to minimize sampling errors. So how important is this? For example, if you did not compute sample size and you just take all, let's say you want to include patients with diabetes admitted in the hospital from 2018 to 2020, you did not compute sample size. What if you only got 100? And then at the end of the study, your conclusion is there's no significant effect. You're not sure whether the conclusion has no significant effect because it's really not significant, or because your sample size is too small and too small to be able to generate valid conclusion. No? So that's to minimize sampling errors. There's issue of validity, both internal and external of the study result. So sampling technique was an example of sampling. That sampling technique. So for example, your population is people living with diabetes mortality of people living in diabetes. So if you sample only patients let's say you're trying to determine the incidence of mortality of people living with diabetes. If you only sample people with diabetes in the hospital, then you will overestimate the mortality rate because the patients in the hospital are sicker. They usually have multiple comorbidities, as opposed to sampling people in the community. You will be able to minimize selection bias. No? So your sample size computation, when you write it up, you should indicate the basis of your computation. No? If you recruit at large sample size than is needed, that's also not good. It doesn't mean the larger the better. No, not all the time. You just need enough. No. If the sample size is too large, it increases the cost and the duration of the study, and it's also unethical, especially if you are doing an interventional study, because you're essentially experimenting on people. So that's considered unethical. The smaller samples, if you have a smaller sample size than needed, it is also unethical because it exposes human subjects to risk with no benefit to scientific knowledge. Because if you have a smaller sample size and you're not able to generate any valid conclusion, why expose them? Why waste their time? So that's unethical also. Next is the data collection or the data collection technique. No? The data collection technique, the intervention, if it's an RCT, or the exposure, if it's an observational study, should be completely described in this section. So if you are going to, let's say, measure, let's say the exposure is the level of HbA1c, then how you determine the HbA1c is important. So you describe the apparatus, the equipment, the model, the manufacturer, the protocol, and how it is taken. Or let's say you're looking at the exposure, the blood pressure reading, no? You should be able to explicitly say how you got the blood pressure reading. If it's drugs or chemicals, if it's an interventional study, you describe exact dosages, mode of administration, generic name, formula, the materials, no? Active ingredient, trademark, manufacturer, nationality, and the treatment details. How are you going to administer it? Is a nurse going to administer it? How often? Daily? Once a week? Once a month? Is it self-administered? Is it self-titrated? Let's say if it's an insulin. So it has to be exact so that other people may be able to reproduce it again in order to validate the findings of your study. So think reproducibility. Next is the study instrument. If you're going to use a study instrument, you need to also describe it in detail. So these are tools by which the data are collected. It could be validated questionnaires or interview questionnaires. It's not just any questionnaire. You cannot just make up your own questionnaire just like that and administer it to your intended respondents. So if you want to do a new questionnaire for your specific study, it's okay, but you have to um, include the details about how you prepare the questionnaire, pre-coding, pre-testing, even the content validity, how you develop it. If you did a validation, it's very important, no? Because the questionnaire should be valid enough to be able to measure truly what you're trying to measure. Because if it's unable to measure, then it's not valid. Okay? Description of other methods of observation is also included here. So what I mentioned before. So for example, if you're looking at the Ferryman-Galloway score in order to measure hirsutism. So the Ferryman-Galloway score is a scoring system where you observe a patient and look for hairs all over the body in order to measure whether the patient has hirsutism or not. So you can explicitly define here how you observe this on your patients. Laboratory tests, screening procedures, BP reading, taking weight of the patient's weight and height, doing anthropometric measurements. Let's say laboratory testing, are you going to do it fasting, non-fasting, predetermination, take an average. So those are some of the examples. So it has to be a comprehensive description. Again, think reproducibility. Which data will be collected and how many observers, are you going to blind them or unblinded by consensus or independent meaning? For example, you're collecting data about radiographic findings. So let's say, you're going to employ two radiologists to read your chest x-rays independently, and if there is a discrepancy between the two, either an independent one will break the tie or they will talk together and agree by consensus. So both of them are correct, but you have to explicitly say it at the beginning of your study. The time period between readings, so for example, if you're going to do blood pressure determination, is it going to be 1 day apart or 15 minutes apart? You have to explicitly describe it in the data collection procedure. Next section of the methods is your outcome measures. The outcome measure, or what we also term as your dependent variable, these are measures chosen to assess the impact of the intervention or exposure. So it should be precisely and clearly defined for the purposes of your study. When we say clearly defined for the purposes of your study, it's not a pathophysiologic definition. So for example, you define one of your outcome measures is myocardial infarction. You don't define it as, what's an example, a blockage of an artery by a thrombus or by an embolus, something like that. But you should define it as MI is defined as according to the ACC definition, characteristic chest pain or its anginal equivalent with elevation of cardiac enzyme or characteristic ECG, ischemic changes. So that's how you clearly define it in for your purposes of the study. So that you'll be able to tell whether your patient meets that outcome measure or not. So there are two kinds. You have your primary outcome, the main reason for the study. Usually this corresponds to your general objective or your primary research question. If you're doing an RCT, this primary outcome determines your sample size computation. In secondary outcome measures, it's only useful to generate further hypotheses. So again, this is just hypothesis generating because this is not where you base your sample size computation for. Case definitions, it could be physician-based, it could be laboratory-based, diagnostic procedure, lay worker-based, or it's the your field investigator that determines, or it could be patient-reported, let's say diagnosis of diabetes as reported by the patient, or diagnosis of asthma based on patient history, using secondary data sources as well. And very important, do not forget also adverse outcome, because sometimes your intervention could be beneficial, but the adverse outcomes outweighs the benefits. No? So that's also important to balance the presentation of your data. Other variables which are not study outcome, we also collect that, like your age, your sex. Usually the variables that is included in table 1, the demographic characteristics like educational or socioeconomic level, nutritional status, because this is where you can find potential effect modifiers or confounders, which we will discuss in the next section of this lecture. Lastly, your data analysis. In your data analysis, what I usually do is, well, there's a part there that I describe what kind of descriptive statistics I will use for which variable, and also for each objective, I write what kind of analysis I will do in order to be able to achieve that objective. So which statistical tests will be used, especially if it's an analytic study. Why was it chosen? On which data? Is it on category, let's say t-test for continuous variables, chi-square for categorical variables, etc. And to determine what, for which objective. It should provide enough details so results can be independently verified by, let's say, another statistician or another study group. Don't forget to check for normality of data if applicable and provide details of the statistical package. I know this can be difficult at your level, so it's very important to ask help from your statistician. The statistician will be able to help you. But you need to ask the help from your statistician at the protocol stage, not when you already have all the data in your hands. It has to be at the protocol stage, not at the end of the study. Okay, very, very important. Common errors when writing up the method section is incomplete description in their study. There's too little information, lack of details about the materials used in the investigation, incomplete information of the statistical methods, irrelevant details. So an example of that would be, let's say your study is intended, the intended audience are gastroenterologists, let's say. You don't need to describe how to insert an NGT or nasogastric tube already, because your intended audience is already specialists. So keep your audience in mind as well. Unnecessary explanation of basic procedures, let's say Foley catheter insertion or subcutaneous injection. And lastly, wrong statistical test. So that's why you really need to have your statistician on board at the beginning of the study, not at the end. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of this lecture. On the next part, we're going to discuss bias and confounding. I decided not to include interaction anymore because I think that's too much for your level already. So we'll just discuss bias and confounding. So see you on our next session.